Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In this month's LONGWave video, I'd like to outline why I don't see an economic recovery back to the levels even approaching those prior to the COVID-19 pandemic for at least a year, possibly much longer. I also need to state at the outset that this is completely different than my view on the stock market, which no longer has anything to do with the economy, fundamentals, valuations, or historic measures of price and risk, at least currently. I believe my prior videos have shown why I feel this, and hopefully this video further supports that view. As such, I'd like to cover those items listed here. I am not a fan of analogies, as they typically fail to represent all the parameters that are different, and though they seem representative in the near term, in the longer term, the missing parameters and distortions can lead to misrepresentation. However, they can serve a useful purpose in better understanding the reality of possible outcomes. One such analogy is the 1929 stock market crash to that which we have recently experienced and attributed to the COVID-19 coronavirus. Since last fall, on numerous occasions, I've shown comparisons with the market run-up prior to the market crashes in 1929, 1987, 2000 specific to the NASDAQ, and 2008. They all were eerily similar and closely called the recent highs. That is because they were all fundamentally bubbles. However, after their crashes, the analogy should be expected to be different because of different policy reactions, the state of the economy preceding the crash, and the actual drivers of those bubbles. The one that is different is the 1929 market crash shown here. Normally, there is a retest of the initial lows as the market finds support. The only market drop comparable to what we recently experienced was 1987. As you can see, we experienced a retest in 1987 before recovering. However, 1929 was different. The markets actually rebounded quite strongly for 6 to 7 months until the spring of 1930. As you can see, they achieved an approximate 50% retracement before heading lower in a sustained fashion. This is very similar to what we have been experiencing in terms of the recent market bounce, neither retesting their lows to find solid support. This is technically unusual unless the cause of the event was an anomaly and perceived to have been a market overreaction. The magnitude of what we have experienced in literally shutting down the world's economy cannot by any stretch of the imagination be seen to be simply a market overreaction. This was a global event that impacted every global market. What we need to understand about a 1929 versus 2020 analogy are a number of factors. First, both came at the end of a decade-long credit expansion. Both credit expansions were unprecedented, resulting in an overextended business cycle and excess debt. The excess debt in 1929 was in the form of uncontrolled market margin debt primarily, while more recently it was the debt to GDP globally for consumers, corporations, and governments. The same problem, but orders of magnitude worse today. Secondly, policy prescriptions were flawed. Today our policy response has been to explode global central bank balance sheets. None more reactive than the U.S., with an increase approaching $4 trillion for the Federal Reserve and a $4 trillion annual fiscal budget deficit increase in the U.S. In 1929, because of the gold standard, this was not an option. Instead, the solution was seen to be trade tariffs, which enacted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was passed by Congress, lifting animal spirits until it was signed into law by President Hoover in the spring, at which time the markets rolled over, buy on the rumors, sell on the news. The solution was seen to be a false panacea. We will soon realize that more of the same is not the right prescription for today either. More on that in a moment. It is eerily similar that the trade war with China, which at least was mollified with stage 1, appears to now be coming apart at the seams as tensions between China and the U.S. seem worse than at the height of the recent trade talks. The coronavirus blame game is triggering reactions that could already destabilize a broken global supply chain infrastructure. This could lead to Smoot-Hawley on steroids. As we all are aware, the 1929 crash front-ended the Great Depression, which lasted through the 1930s. I don't want to take our analogy too far, but another observation is that the ongoing bear market rallies that occurred, shown here with green arrows, all preceded market tops to lower lows as euphoria was slowly taken out of the markets. It will take similar bear market rallies to remove the expectations we presently have. Expectations based on the fact that liquidity and bailouts will quickly restore the U.S. and global economy. I need to reinforce that these charts reflect the markets when equity markets actually reflected the economy. This is not the case today. However, they give you a perspective on what to expect with the economy, employment, and consumer sentiment versus how the traders and plethora of market manipulators we have today will react, assuming they can stay solvent and continue to bet other people's money for trading profits and people don't pull that money back. This is the best chart I can use to link how I see the market reacting versus the economy. Though we have unprecedented levels of liquidity being pumped into the system, it takes time for it to work its effectiveness into the system, especially after the system has taken a hit. Like an athlete that takes a hard hit, it takes him or her a few moments to shake off the hit, get their bearings, and adjust to how to resume back into the game. Liquidity in the form of money supply in relation to Treasury and S&P market cap shows to some degree that stall. This analogy suggests an approximate 8-month delay. The chances are high that markets are headed lower in the short term to intermediate term before violently heading higher, in my opinion, even if the economy is headed into an era of stagflation and potentially deep recession. How high and sustained that lift will be is a discussion about coming fancy currency failures, which is still ahead and likely not a 2020-2021 concern. Let's start with the economy and the markets in the short term. 45 days ago, the sense that the economy was on pause, like your VCR or DVD, and will restart immediately when the pause is removed, has come to be seen, as we previously expressed, as comically wrong. Our view is that the economy, especially on a global basis, is inherently a complex integration of interdependent processes. To us, it is more likely to accelerate with an analogy of a 16-wheeler tractor-trailer. Unlike a car, it must methodically go through upwards of 16 gears to get to full speed. Under heavy load and from a dead stop, that time and distance is significant for that tractor-trailer, if you have ever experienced following one. Cars may accelerate past, but the tractor-trailer has no recourse. The heavier the load, the more time it takes. We're talking a global economy here, which would be about as heavy a load as I can imagine. We have discussed previously that stimulus spending and liquidity pumping has lost its effectiveness. More money in circulation no longer delivers the GDP growth it once did. That is a fact, and in fact has become a burden in the form of increasing debt payments on an already heavily encumbered global economy. Velocity of money in circulation has been steadily falling for 3 decades and has plummeted since the 2007 financial crisis. What is going to make money accelerate in a slowing economy? Unfortunately, eventually it will be hyperinflation, which leads to why I think stocks will take off in another year or less. Basic economic theory in the form of quantity theory of money says that boosted money supply, with velocity of money even holding the same, suggests that prices will rise if output remains the same. However, output will not remain the same, and therefore prices are likely not to spike, but rather potentially rise slowly as the economy slowly recovers. This, of course, removes shortages from that equation of thought. We are highly likely headed towards a period, as I've discussed in a previous video, to a period of protracted economic stagflation. Profit expectations have significantly fallen and is predominantly being driven by only 5 stocks and historic forward PE ratios, presently keeping the markets levitated. Cash flows are a massive solvency problem, and as a consequence, dividends and stock buybacks are being slashed. Almost all free cash flow has gone to buybacks and dividends since 2014. Over $5 trillion has been spent on buybacks and dividends, which has kept the market supported. Pulling these supporting pillars out from the market will highly likely have devastating consequences despite central bank actions, short of direct purchases of the equity markets by the central banks or financial guarantees, that is, unofficial nationalization. This may still be a year away. The second yield curve steepening has normally triggered a sustained market sell-off, highlighted here in yellow and pink. This suggests a weak equity market through the U.S. general elections in early November 2020. Despite the massive amounts of relief money being spent, at least in the U.S., little is actually reaching Main Street. We recently highlighted this in the May Under the Lens video entitled Regime Change. The problem for a recovering economy in 2020 is about the consumer and small business, and unfortunately they're going to be hit the hardest, which simply does not bode well for the recovery. In case you've forgotten, the whole purpose of the coronavirus lockdown was to flatten the curve to allow the containment within the capabilities of hospitals to handle critical cases. Nothing has been done to actually stop the virus, only the rate of a highly infectious and deadly virus. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed more people in wave 2 versus the initial wave. Immunization is still ahead and appears as more versions of the virus mutate will be difficult to stop. Herd immunization appears the inevitable outcome, which means the virus is with us for another year, 18 months. The impact of social distancing will very much control the economic recovery. Consumer confidence, sentiment, and comfort indicators suggest a worried society, which is notoriously risk-averse when worried. Hunkering down will be with us in at least the near term, minimally for the next 12 months. The VIX, which was at recent highs, is telling us that the whole shorting of the VIX strategy has been put on hold. It is this strategy which has reduced the costs of risk and options premium that has afforded highly leveraged market positioning. The cost of leverage and hedging is now significantly impacted. With the price of securities as measured by market cap to GDP at all-time highs, the risk-reward to undertake highly leveraged returns, which are more costly, at least temporarily, is likely to be left to only the most aggressive speculators in the short term. I could go on with many more issues, which are cyclically more or less in nature, which market traders focus on. The bigger problem for the economy going forward may be secular trends already underway and possibly accelerated by the coronavirus and the global oil shock. Here are just a few major trends that are potentially now underway. Returning to our 16-wheeler analogy used previously, this is equivalent to asking our tractor-trailer to start from a standing stop while on a heavy upward incline. An already slow acceleration would only be much slower and take much longer, if it was even possible. These 10 risks, already looming large before COVID-19 struck, now threaten to fuel a perfect storm that sweeps the entire global economy into potentially a decade of despair. I'm optimistic that eventually technology and possibly more competent political leadership may be able to reduce, resolve, or minimize many of these problems, giving rise to a more inclusive, cooperative, and stable international order. But any happy ending assumes that we find a way to survive the coming potential Greater Depression. I'm not going to go through each of these. They are well described in the link at the bottom of the slide. What all this tells us is how foolish it is to believe that the market crash is over, at least yet. Market crashes don't end with this degree of euphoric market expectations. Bull markets do. I refer you to this chart. Asset prices still have more to run. It just needs some time to adjust to the shock. The central banks and government policies are trapped of their own doing. I suspect current liquidity will soon shrink as U.S. Treasury borrowing crowds out the private economy and even overwhelms Fed purchases. The liquidity needs are massive, with the U.S. Treasury already likely to issue over $5 trillion in debt this year alone. We're locked into a roadmap that has always ended one way when we remove ourselves from the principles of sound money. As I always remind you in every video, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. It is the only thing they ever effectively can agree on or are willing to do. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. They're trapped. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. Thank you for listening, and until next month, may 2020 be an outstanding investment year for you and your family.